Wel, prynhawn da. Wda midach. Good afternoon. Ymlaen ti'r prynhawn yma yw cael eich croesawu chi'n bresog iawn i ganolfan Nes Pedwar Egin yma ar gampws Caerfyrddin, Prifysgol Cymru, y Drindod Dewi Sant. A hynny ar gyfer y ddiweddaraf mewn cyfres o ddarlithoedd agoriadol gan academyddion anrydeddwyd a theitl athro gan y Brifysgol. It's my great privilege this afternoon to extend to you all a very warm welcome to Canolfan Nes Pedwar Egin here on the Carmarthen campus of the University of Wales, Trinity St David, for this, the latest in a series of inaugural lectures to be delivered by academics who have recently received professorial titles from the university. And this afternoon's inaugural lecture will be delivered by Professor Miriam Plantinga, Associate Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Academic Experience. The university is delighted to see that so many of you have been able to join us this afternoon and to join Professor Plantinga on this very, very special occasion, either here in person or indeed in the virtual room. And I'm reliably informed that the audience this afternoon includes some of Professor Plantinga's many friends from her days at the University of St Andrews, family members and friends back home in Holland, as well as members of Peniel WI and friends and colleagues from the university. And we are particularly pleased to welcome Professor Plantinga's parents to this afternoon's event. They have travelled to Carmarthen in order to attend this afternoon's lecture. Rinske and Foko, hartelijk welcome in Wales. Croeso cynnes iawn I chi I Gymru. Unfortunately, the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Medwyn Hughes, is unable to be with us this afternoon. However, he has prepared a brief video recording for us, and with your consent, I'd like to share the video with you before I proceed to formally introduce Professor Plantinga.
I'm extremely disappointed that I can't be with you tonight, Miriam, in the Egin. But I do want to send this message of congratulations. I was delighted that the university was minded to approve your professorship. It signifies the enormous respect within the university of your academic standing. Your colleagues, your peers, acknowledge all you have undertaken on behalf of the university. I first met you when I came to Lampeter as a Vice-Chancellor, and I was so impressed by your leadership within the Classics Department. I then appointed you as Dean, and the clarity of your engagement as Dean is something I well remember. And then over the years, as Associate Pro-Vice-Chancellor, you have given outstanding service to the university. The clarity of your work, your commitment has been outstanding. Many, many congratulations to you. This is a great achievement. And tonight, the university has the opportunity to mark and to celebrate your academic achievement. Llongyfarchiadau, dwi'n falch iawn ohonych chi. Mae hwn yn gam pwysig iawn yn eich datblygiad chi o fewn y Brifysgol. This is a very important development point for you within the university. But I am sure it is only the start of developing your leadership. And over the years, you will make an enormous contribution to the life of the University of Wales, Trinity St David. I wish you well for the future.
Diolch i'r Is-Gynghellor am ei eiriau pwrpasol ac ymosod y digwyddiad hwn yn ei gyd-destun. The rite of passage to become a professor in a university has for hundreds of years included the test of having to profess your knowledge to a lay audience and fellow academics. Indeed, the origin of the title professor comes from the need to profess or declare publicly one's knowledge. And as I've mentioned at previous events, an inaugural lecture is an occasion of significance in an academic staff member's career at the university. It provides our professors with the opportunity to share their achievements in research, innovation, engagement, and teaching activities before an audience of members of the university community and the general public. This afternoon, it is the turn of Professor Miriam Plantinga to deliver her inaugural lecture, having been awarded a professorship by the university in recent times. Professor Plantinga graduated with a classics degree from the University of Amsterdam before completing her PhD in Greek at the University of St Andrews. After graduating, Professor Plantinga became a lecturer in classics at Durham University. She has worked at the University of Wales, Trinity St David since the year 2000, first as a lecturer in classics and then as the head of the classics department. She became the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities in 2010 and was appointed Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Student Experience in 2015 and subsequently as Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Academic Experience in 2019. During this afternoon's lecture, Professor Plantinga will explore the relevance of Hellenistic poetry and art for us today, focusing on key themes such as collaboration, community, identity and engagement, themes that are particularly apt to reflect upon during the university's bicentenary celebrations. Distinguished guests, colleagues and friends, it gives me great pleasure to invite my good friend and colleague, Professor Miriam Plantinga, to deliver her inaugural professorial lecture entitled Collaboration, Community, Identity and Engagement from Hellenistic Poetry and Art to the Bicentenary. Miriam.
Thank you, Gwilym, and thank you very, very much to everyone who's here. And I'd also particularly like to welcome everyone who's on the live stream as well. And hartelijk bedankt voor iedereen die in Nederland erbij is. It's going to be about 45 minutes, and I am assuming no knowledge whatsoever of classics. So in this lecture, I'll be going back to my roots and look at Hellenistic poetry and art and link it to what we find here today. So if we look at my lecture, it's going to be in 3 parts. I'm going to start with Apollonius Rhodius and look at the opening of the epic, at the catalogue of heroes. And then in the second part, I'll move on to art and consider the Pergamon frieze on the altar of Zeus. And in the final part, I'm going to look at the relevance of Hellenistic and poetry and art for us, working here at the university now, particularly in the light of our bicentenary. Now, I have tried to do what Sarah Clark asked me to do, which is to link classics with the QAA. And I think I've managed to do that. But I also, thinking back to when I started in 2000 and thinking to what Dylan was telling me today and Randolph was telling me today, I've been, when I started and wanted to do a module on Hellenistic poetry, they said, a bit niche, Miriam, you do art as well, don't you? Can you put some art in there so that it becomes slightly less esoteric? So here we have, again, poetry and art. And so the poetry first and then the art and following by the bicentenary. So let's then start in my first part and some key facts about Apollonius. So Apollonius wrote his epic, the Argonautica, during the 3rd century BC in Alexandria in Egypt, during a post-classical period that looked back at the classical golden age of the 5th century BC in Greece, and Homer before that, but also stepped out in its own right, reflecting the changing world and a world that is opening up. The literature and art produced during this period between 323 and 30 BC is called Hellenistic poetry and art. And the epic is about a mythical journey of the Argonauts to obtain the Golden Fleece, a difficult task set by a king, Pelias, to a hero, Jason, who during this journey meets Medea, who is cast in the role of a traditional helper maiden, a role we often find in mythology. The epic then foreshadows what will happen between Jason and Medea later, as told by Euripides in his tragedy, but does not cover those events. So in the first section of my paper, I'm going to start by taking you to the very beginning and the end of the epic, and then concentrate on the catalogue of heroes. For those of you who have watched over Easter the 1963 movie Jason and the Argonauts and had hoped for some epic adventures, magic encounters, strange peoples, great mythology, excitement and suspense, I'm afraid that I'm going to disappoint you. But hopefully what I will look at today will make up more than that. And if you told me a decade ago that I would choose willingly the catalogue as an item to present to you, I would have laughed. But again, I was someone who would always go for the adventures first. So let's have a look at the opening of the epic. In the very first line, the poet celebrates the deeds and the reputation of the old-time mortals, signalling that this quest is taking place during a mythical time in the past, and emphasizing the collective by not singling any of the Argonauts out by name in the opening of the epic, but instead using a very neutral word, men or mortals, and Jason is only mentioned in line 8. The key role of the poet is immediately stressed. I relate, I recall. The verb that is used here is linked to memory. The poet's singing of the epic ensures that the deeds of the heroes are not forgotten and that their reputation and fame are maintained. But through that singing, as a guardian of collective memory, the poet also plays a key role in establishing identity through narrative, through the stories told. The epic looks back to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but positions this epic in a very different way, and this is typical of what we find in this era. The opening of the Iliad stresses the disastrous result of the clashing of two individuals within a group, between Agamemnon and Achilles. Like the Odyssey, the Argonautica focuses on a journey, but unlike the Odyssey, where we find Odysseus returning home alone, after trying but failing to rescue his companions, here we find an emphasis on the heroes returning as a collective. And this is where we go to right at the end to just have a quick look. When you know your Iliad, the end of the epic pointedly emphasizes again the collective and innocent competition. Heroes will be heroes. And this is one about who's the first to draw water and get it back to the ship. The kind of rivalry that stays firmly within epic heroic boundaries, and again, without any individuals being mentioned by name. Both opening and closing lines of the epic then emphasize the community of heroes and their collective undertaking. But let's just go back for one moment, and I'm interested in the sentence there to this day. What is interesting for us here is that the poet draws attention to the result of this friendly competition. He notes that this custom exists to this day, the 3rd century BC. So what we find then is that mythology leaves traces in the landscape, and that it is these customs and the telling of stories that ensures that a connection is established and maintained between past and present. So we are in good company, and what I'm doing here now, considering the relevance of what we find in the past for us here in the present, is something that Apollonius was already doing himself. So if we look at the final part of the epic, and I'm particularly interested in "May these songs of mine year by year be sweeter for men to sing." The telling of these stories is an iterative process. The epic has come to its end with the arrivals of the heroes back home, but by uttering the wish that the stories may year by year be sweeter, the poet draws attention to the epic roots in oral poetry and the performative element associated with epic. It is only by singing these stories that the fame, illustrious deeds, and identity of the heroes are preserved. Singing, memory, and celebration frame the epic, with the ending leading us back to the beginning, start singing again, in a never-ending cycle. So let's now go to the catalogue itself. It's a traditional element in epic. There's an extensive one in Iliad, and in the Argonautica it takes up just about 200 lines. In the catalogue, the poet names all of the heroes on board the Argo and gives a short biographical vignette for each hero. So I'm going to focus on what the catalogue tells us about identity and about collaboration. Now, the identity of each hero is built up in a similar way, and we'll see that when we look through 7 or 8 very short examples. And that's done by the inclusion of a number of core elements: the name, the ancestry, the geography, where they've come from, the specific skill, and the deeds either from the hero themselves or from their ancestor leading up to this. And then we have a space for a lot of variation. So we get their weapon, key features of their physique, what they're wearing, etc. The skill of the narrator can be seen by the variation within these short vignettes and the rhythm of the narrative, avoiding what could so easily become a boring enumeration. And then X joined. And X was also on the boat, and X joined for 200 lines. So if we just look at a few examples and draw some conclusions. So here we have at the start, we have the name and the family being emphasized in bold. And so we've got a few examples now. We've got Polyphemus, who comes from Larissa, is the son of Elatus. And then we get a bit of stuff who once, when there were Lapiths and Centaurs, so that refers to an earlier epic mythology event. And then we have Coronis, who is the son of Cainus. He also came. He left a place behind which was wealthy, i.e. there's something that you leave when you join a quest like this. He wasn't yet his father's equal because his father, and then we get a bit of story about his father. We also get Oileus. He's skilled at a particular act of harrying, a military prowess he's got, but nothing else we get about him. We get another warrior. He's a son of a brave man. We get another one, again, a stout spearman. We see that his father released him, though he had no other sons to support him through his old age and livelihood, and send him forth, his best beloved, his only son, to earn fame. So you see why they're going there, to earn fame, but you also see what it costs. And then the next one, we see Thisphis, again, a son of Hagnas. He's skilled in storms and hurricanes and stars. So again, something very useful to have on a ship. And he was chosen by the goddess Athena herself, and everyone was really happy to have him. And then we've got Heracles, the biggest hero of all. Now Heracles is a bit of an interesting case because he's just, as we see here in this passage, he's just caught the wild boar. Now, those who know their mythology know that Heracles did 10 labours, and this labour, the boar, is number 4. So he goes off or AWOL basically from his 10 labours for a tiny bit to be part of this boat, and disappears at the end of book 1 and goes back to doing his labours. So we also see that just having people with a lot of biceps is not really where we're going for. We've got people who are overconfident in their mighty muscles, but we've also got someone with extremely excellent eyesight. Again, someone you want when you go on a journey. And then we've got someone who's dressed in a local bearskin. He's got an axe. And his grandfather tried to avoid him joining the quest by hiding his weapons in an attempt to not have him join the boat. And then we get to the end. So those are the little examples of how you see the name, lineage, geography, skill, and the deeds. So what we see in these examples is that Apollonius establishes first their individual identity before they receive a group identity, which we see in this passage. Such was a tally of all those who gathered to Jason's aid. Men dwelling around about knew these heroes, everyone, as Minians, since most of them claim to be in the line from the daughter of Miniae. So that name only comes at the end. Importantly, that group identity is enhanced by individual identities in their midst. We've seen a few times that heroes welcome their fellow comrades, and that the success of each hero adds to the success of the group rather than cause friction. The catalogue also emphasises that heroes are gathered from wide and far. The place of origin is mentioned for almost all the heroes, and the majority of verbs used emphasise motion. The heroes came from, were not left behind, did not stay in, left, joined from. The inclusion of so much geography stresses that this is an important quest, but the emphasis on the gathering of the heroes also highlights the effort made by each hero to become part of the team and the process of assembling individuals into a new collective. This gathering of heroes then also draws attention to the process of becoming a team. Teams take time to be created. The heroes are joining actively, are answering the call, choose to join, and are willing to take risks to become part of the team. Their bond of comrades is also created as a result of what they leave behind. Several times, as we've seen, leaving is hard, particularly for the loved ones left behind, the risks associated with such a long journey. The emphasis on the different skills and capability of each of the heroes, prophecy, science of seafaring, martial planning, shows that the group identity is able to encompass a whole range of individual identities. It also emphasises the partnership of each hero within the team and the fact that the responsibility for the success of the undertaking is shared. This is, Sarah, in leadership methodology, and I've learned that from you, an adaptive challenge where heroes are undertaking a task which they can only achieve together and none can do alone. But this narrative of who they are, also, as is typical for Hellenistic poetry and art, includes a much wider range of ages, abilities and skills, and allows a much wider group of heroes the chance to contribute and to participate. This is more a rugby than a rowing or basketball team. The catalogue maintains the close links between singing, naming, remembering and celebrating that we noted when we looked at the beginning and the closure of the epic. By naming each hero, his deeds and lineage are remembered and celebrated. In fact, many of the vignettes are in themselves a mini-epic by connecting this epic, the Argonautica, to other myths and epics, by recalling the deeds of ancestors that still live on in memory. At the end of the catalogue, in the passage you've got on the screen, it says that the poet that men dwelling about knew about these heroes. They knew because of the circulation of stories by poets and the establishment and maintenance of fame and reputation through narrative, remembrance and celebration. So I've looked at the team, I've looked at variation, I've looked at individual group identity, importantly celebration, positioning against the past, and how narrative is important for describing who we are and who we aspire to be. So let's look at the second one, which is the Pergamon frieze on the altar of Zeus. So we move to the 2nd century BC, a bit later, and the west coast of Asia Minor, to the kingdom of the Attalids and the capital of Pergamon. So you will see on the screen what is nowadays Turkey, and you see Pergamon just in the top left there. The Attalids reigned in the Hellenistic kingdoms developed after the death of Alexander the Great. For those new Hellenistic rulers, establishing their identity was important. And this is where we're going to see the relationship between power and identity and the use of a building program and art to establish identity. Amidst rivaling Hellenistic kingdoms, the Attalids were keen to position their city as a second Athens and to show that they were the legitimate heirs to continue the legacy of classical Greece. They sponsored artists and established Pergamon as a centre of Greek art and culture. So this shows the map of the Acropolis above Pergamon. Here we see clearly that this is a planned city with all the elements expected on an Acropolis. We see an agora on the far right, central public space. We see stoas at the bottom. There's an example of that, a portico. We see a theatre in the middle. We see a temple of Athena, sanctuary of Athena, within the palatial quarters. This will become a bit clearer later. We see the altar of Zeus, which is what we're going to focus upon. And we also see a library and then several royal palaces. But before we then are going to focus on that altar, I would like to give you an idea of what the Acropolis looked like, an idea of the buildings surrounding the altar of Zeus. So I've given you just some to give you your bearings. This is a Roman temple, the Trajan one, so ignore that one. But the theatre you see there, and then you see what that may have looked like, and you see the sanctuary of Athena behind the palace walls. So you see the Athena slightly higher and the altar of Zeus in a line clearly linked. And this gives you a bit more. Now, if you thinking back to the photograph with the wonderful, seeing really good how it looks as an Acropolis, you may wonder what has happened. Where is the altar of Zeus? Why is it not possible to see any of it in the contemporary photo of the Acropolis? That's because it's not there. Towards the end of the 19th century, the entire altar was moved by German archaeologists to Berlin, where it was moved to a dedicated Pergamon museum, which was purpose-built between 1910 and 1930. The links between art and power and the use of art to establish identity continues, as the explicit purpose of the acquisition was to establish collections in Berlin that could rival those in London and Paris. What happened to the altar during the Second World War and after the Second World War during the Cold War is quite a story and the subject of another lecture. So let's now consider in a bit more detail the altar of Zeus. There is still a lot of uncertainty. There's continuing debate in relation to when the altar was built. Building work is certain to have started after 197 BC, with some scholars opting for dates after 180 and others between 166 and 156. And I think the intricacies of this, Kyle is going to be my friend if there's any questions around that. Functions of the altar their function is also still much disputed. It's an altar rather than a temple, and it's thought that sacrifices could have been performed in the sacred precinct you see in the middle. There are further disputes to whom the altar is dedicated. Is it to Zeus or to Zeus and Athena? But what is clear is that it is a monumental building. It is huge. And the fact that it took years to construct shows clearly the Attalids' commitment to the project and their longer term vision when it comes to building identity for them as rulers, but also for their people and kingdom. So the altar consists of interior and exterior friezes. So the exterior frieze is what wraps around. The interior frieze is behind the colonnades in the middle. The exterior frieze, which is what I'm focusing on, depicts the Gigantomachy, a traditional mythological battle between the gods and the giants. The interior frieze, which is much more fragmented, depicts the life of Telephos, who was the mythical founder of the Attalid dynasty and son of Heracles, the greatest Greek hero, because you want to have Heracles in your ancestry. Again, we see how mythology is used to further cement identity as a legitimate Greek heir. So the Telephos frieze is on a much smaller scale than the exterior frieze. It is 158 meters high, which I have looked up in feet, would be around 5'2". The other one is 2.3 meters, so 7.5 feet, so much bigger. So the Telephos frieze celebrates a series of events in the life of the founder through its visual biographical narrative, in contrast to the one moment in battle depicted on the exterior frieze. So I've given you an example very briefly of this frieze, primarily to show you the contrast with the exterior frieze. So on the left, we have Heracles, heroic size. You see the blown up muscles, much bigger than the figures on the right, which are another part of the frieze. And we see baby Telephos suckling just on the right corner. The other thing which I think is interesting in the frieze is how they use perspective, and that's where if you look at the second one on the right, you see one figure coming to the front, and then perspective is by having a very low relief for the second one, really behind it. And also what we see is not that easy visible, but they also start to use empty space at the top to signify the sky and start to kind of use that as a way of telling the narrative. But let's now focus on the exterior frieze and get you some key facts first. So it's 133 meters long. It's got 120 slabs, and you can see the slabs, each of these segments. They're 2.3 meters tall. There's about 100 life-size figures. It's about 75% remaining, and it's very high in depth. It sort of comes out. The stairway is 20 meters leading up to the altar. So the size of the altar and the frieze immediately raise questions about the artist who made this. Not much is known about them. Fragments of signatures have been found, but that is about it. But the consensus is that while there is a clear single artistic vision behind the frieze, which unites the different vignettes, the frieze is the result of the collaboration of a group of expert artists who either would have worked at Pergamon or would have been attracted to Pergamon by the Attalids for this project. They would have carved the frieze in sections, and it is thought that the frieze displays different styles of carving. And again, there's a debate about whether we would have had master carvers and then assistant carvers. But again, that is highly debatable still. So how did they achieve that unity of vision, especially since there's no apparent structure to the frieze and the battle just rages on along the entire side of the frieze? The two principal ways: thematic ordering and consistent overarching geography. So this gives you a bit of what you'll pick things up when I go through it. The eastern frieze, we see the most important Olympian gods. The southern frieze is for the gods of heaven, the western frieze for the gods of the ocean, and on the northern frieze we have Aphrodite, Ares, Poseidon, and then a lot of question marks and tentatively identified goddesses of fate, goddesses of revenge, more difficult to see. The names of the gods would have been given above. The giant names would have been given below, and the assumption is that this would also have been brightly painted. The iconography has a very consistent use of message and imagery, which makes it really simple to read from a narrative point of view. Despite all these kind of issues with the building, it is easy to read. The gods always win. The giants always lose. The gods are associated with the top of the frieze with heaven. The giants are associated with the bottom of the frieze with earth, in recognition that the giants are the children of Mother Earth, of Gaia. The gods are serene, calm. The giants are full of pathos and about to die. The giants are always male, either young or old, and usually have clubs, rocks, or fight with their bare hands. The gods, we have a lot of goddesses who are in exquisite drapery, and they are associated with civilization, with order, with sky, with the Greeks. The giants with nature, with animals, with beasts, with chaos, and the barbarians. In short, this is a battle between good and evil. So the simplicity of the message belies the complexities behind the surface meaning. The consensus seems to be that this is not a monument depicted to celebrate a particular victory or set of victories, but instead could be a generic victory moment, a monument commemorating the triumphs of the Attalids over surrounding regions, over Macedonians, Galatians, and Seleucids. It's the very use of mythology that enables the monument to function as something more universal and transcend a celebration of a particular battle. This is victory on an epic scale. So while this is true, what is absolutely key, though, is that for the Attalids, this exterior frieze reinforces their claim to be the heir of Greek civilization through a very specific visual reference. On the metopes of the Parthenon, the metopes are the small storyboards between the pillars. On the metopes of the Parthenon, the Temple of Athena at Athens, created during the 5th century BC to celebrate their victory over barbaric Persian forces, the metopes on the east side depict a gigantomachy. It is then no surprise that the Attalids choose the same battle between gods and giants to celebrate their military victories, and that secondly, the eastern frieze at Pergamon, the frieze that viewers would see first, depicts the most important Olympian gods and directly goes back to the east frieze, the eastern metopiece on the Parthenon Temple of Athena. So this one gives you an example of one of those metopes, and it's depicting, believe me, the god Dionysus. It was nearly destroyed when a Christian church was built on the site, and it shows the fragility of narrative and how easy it is to lose a narrative. Now the next slide gives you, this is from a battle between the Lapids and the Centaurs, gives you a better idea of what the gigantomachy would have looked like. We note on the metope, which is the storyboard, 2 isolated figures, some depth, but not as high relief as on Pergamon, a lot of empty space, and a limited sense of movement and drama. Now, looking back, you also can see how high up it would have been. We're halfway the pillars, the columns, and if you look at it, how high up it would have been very difficult for a viewer to engage. So the experience of the viewer of the Pergamon frieze is very different. What is important for the Attalids is to establish their identity as rulers and their identity of their kingdom, and for that, the engagement of the wider community is critical. The use of monumental buildings to create community identity is well known from ancient time and continues to this day. The use of specialist artists means that the construction was a task for a relatively small team of experts. The engagement of the viewer then becomes even more important, ensuring that the viewer becomes an active participant in the narrative rather than a passive viewer. Now, that engagement is achieved in a number of ways. So it is in the publicly accessible part of the Acropolis. It's not the palace quarters. It's on the exterior of the building, again, where people could see it and would walk past. The sheer scale towering above the viewer and their proximity to it. This is coming at you. This is really, you're walking past, this is really coming at you. The use of very high relief, it's almost in 3D. Of course, it is still in the frieze, but it's almost coming out. The positioning of figures in space, so we don't get them from the side as we used to in other friezes, but some of them are frontal, other ones are going that way, some of them are with a back to us. So we see the position of figures into space is really, really varied. We also see that there's very little space left empty. We don't have what we saw with the Lapiths and the Centaurs, or what we saw in the Telephos frieze. Bodies are interlinking and figures are crowded and crammed in. Space is filled up with wings, with snake-like figures. We see heads coming out of the top of the frieze, feet coming out of the bottom of the frieze. The figures really spill over. We also see a sense of movement. The battle surges continually, some figures moving in this direction, others in that. Now, if you're walking past and some lines are going that way, others are going that way, you're always halted. You don't just move on because all the figures are moving with you. Some are moving the other way. The drama, the emotion, the pathos of the conflict and death through exaggerated features. And above all, and this is when we're going into having a good look at some of them, the individual details within each vignette. Because if the iconography is really straightforward, it's the individual details that keep your attention and keep you wanting to return again and again and again. Every hairstyle of the female goddesses is different. Every boot of the female goddesses that they're wearing is different, as we will see. So this one is a crucial one on the eastern side, and in the middle we see the figure of Athena with her shield and a gorgon on it. We see Gaia, the earth goddess, sort of in a supplicatory movement, you know, because all her sons are being killed. We see a giant being killed there, and on the far right with the wing, and you see an arm just going like that, we have Nike, the goddess of victory, crowning Athena at the moment of victory in battle. This slide, we see on the left Apollo, on the right, well, in the middle, we see Artemis. They were a sister and brother, and because the way they're positioned, one facing this way, one facing that way, they create, as it were, a mini vignette. You also can see Artemis easily identified. She's a huntress, so she has a short tunic on so that she can move very easily. Her hair is up. You can see the youth of both Apollo and Artemis, and you can see the serenity of these female gods, of Artemis and of Apollo, and then the pathos of the giant. So I've got a bit of a detail here as well. You see the gruesome detail of the giant poking his eye into Artemis' dog, but also have a look at the boot of Artemis. Have a look at the calf, the way the calf is done, the way it's done under the knee, but also the shaggy hair of the giant, the dog biting, the hair in the armpit, the exaggerated figures of the dying giant. Now, what I've given to you here just is a Roman copy of a famous lost Hellenistic sculpture, that of a dying Gaul, celebrating an Attalid victory over the Galatians, which is where the Gauls had emigrated to and settled. I've just put it in here to give you a comparison between the hair of the giant that we just saw and the hair of this Gaul. Both have an unruly mass of hair, signifying both of them as barbarians. Here, I've got a few slides which just focus on these female goddesses. You see here, instead of a hunting dog, we have a lion. we have a figure which is moving away, 3/4, thought to be Gorgo. This is a wonderful one. It's the goddess Nyx, probably, goddess of the night, with a urn with snakes around it, which she's about to hurl at some poor giants. And we can see how the drapery, how the hair, again, is done very, very differently, but also see this figure with his back towards you. And then the other one I wanted to show you is two goddesses. You've got the goddess of dawn and the goddess of moon. They're both seated on a horse. So you see repetition. You've got similar type goddesses, goddess of the dawn, goddess of the moon. They're both on a horseback, but you see that one is frontal, one is with the back to you, one is with really, really heavy drapery, which almost obscures the body, and one of them is with exquisite, delicate drapery, which really shows off the body. And then you see the horse, one with a fur on top to provide some, a seat on top of the horse, and one without that. So you see a lot of variation between them. So what have we seen then? We've seen how monumental buildings are used by rulers to create identity. The importance of time needed to build, establish and maintain an identity. The importance of art to create identity through a visual narrative. How the use of mythology ensures a sense of orientation towards the past for the creation of identity, using the same mythical narrative and a similar message as used on the Parthenon. At the same time, there's a strong sense of not being shackled by the past, of being able to forge creatively a new identity in the present, and to present the same subject matter in a radically different visual way. Each of the vignettes on the Pergamon frieze have their own distinctive character and individual identity, is carefully maintained within the overarching group identities of gods and giants. Building identity is then the result of linking the past and present and positioning against the past. But it is also about the importance of the wider community and the creation of a shared community identity. This monument does this particularly powerfully through the engagement of the viewer and their resulting partnership in the understanding of the narrative. So from the distant past, we now move to our own past and present in the final short part of my lecture, where I will reflect on what we've learned from studying ancient epic and art and what that means for us now. I will start with some brief reflections on graduation and then finish with some thoughts on the bicentenary. Within a university context, graduation is our version of the catalogue. We see here quite minimal personal details for each graduate. We know their name, the subject they studied, the award they gained, and in some cases details about the prize won. The key importance to their individual identity is above all their name. Recognition of individual achievement is important, and not just one-to-one, but on a public stage in front of a larger community to witness the event and engage with it as active participants. We have seen how important it is that we have individual identity. When we saw in the news the protests from students and families when they found out at another university that catch-up graduation ceremonies were planned in groups without students being called out individually by name. A graduation has the same repetition as we find in catalogues, the same consistency of message as we found on the frieze. But within it, again, we see the infinite variety, the pride of a student walking on stage, the particular vocal support of some families, seeing children cheer their parent on stage, the joy of a cohort, the outfits, the height of the heels. Our team then, our comms team then, publish on our website the stories of a number of graduates and publish photos for each of the ceremonies. The vignettes often follow a similar format and note. Their background, often a struggle getting to university, getting through university, reflect on the support from their tutors and talk about the next step in their journey. But within this, I think, genre with set elements, it's the variation that draws the eye and which creates that personal narrative of celebration. Again, we see that written and visual narratives work together to create identity. Graduation is where we can see the transformative power of education on an individual, but also on families and wider communities. What we see then at graduation is that there's a dense web of narratives. We have the narrative of the continuing community of the whole university, but also within that narrative belonging to groups, the Class 22, the Jones family, and to individuals. A narrative of celebration that is, as EPIC strives for, repeated over the years and becomes sweeter each time it's sung. So let's now, for the very final part of the lecture, move to the bicentenary and to us. The linear line of history shows the arc of history. Our founders didn't establish their colleges for the short time. And so often, when we look at the last 200 years and at the colleges that make up UWTSD, there are moments that we can pinpoint and say, O'Mahoheed, still here. As part of the bicentenary, we have naturally reflected on our past and have linked past and present through noting our continued mission to widening participation, to provide education for those who would otherwise have found it hard to go to university. We've continued the values of our founders, but have also continued to forge and develop our identity and create a distinct new narrative. As a university, we've been on our own epic voyage over the past 200 years, with the mergers taking this to a monumental scale over the past 12 years, requiring us to create a new shared identity together. Establishing a new identity when different colleges come together isn't easy and takes time. And collaboration across units, across campuses and across people has been the key to success. Together we've undertaken numerous projects that we could not have done alone, but only together. Think of our work on data and league tables, on partnerships, on the TEF, on research degrees, on student cases, on student voice and representation with the Students' Union, on equality and diversity, on learning and teaching, on the QA with COVID, and I know that you can all mention other teams. Behind the seemingly straight line of our history with foundations, name changes and mergers, there is a narrative of all the teams that have ensured that the lives of our students could continue to be transformed, and the narrative of engagement that ensured that strong communities were built. EPIC and art then remind us to take the time to remember, and above all to celebrate achievements. It shows us the importance of storytelling, whether through literature or by visual means, to create a narrative of identity and of telling and retelling the story of who we are and who we aspire to be. The narrative of the university, but also the narrative of so many teams and individuals. Such narratives help to support a collective vision and become key to developing a shared identity. And as a final thought, I'd like to leave you with a quotation from Jonathan Sachs. If you want to build a team, create a team that builds. A team where individual identity is important, where people come together to collaborate with different skills, different strengths and different perspectives, where the success of each adds to the success of the team, where a shared identity is developed through collaboration. A team that builds together for the good of their wider communities, always ensuring that all are included through strong engagement and partnership models. It is only together that, inspired by our past, we can build for the future. Thank you.
Well, gyfeillion, on behalf of all of us here in the Regin and those present elsewhere virtually in the virtual room, congratulate Professor Plantinga on delivering such an illuminating, highly relevant and timely lecture this afternoon. You've certainly mesmerised us as an audience through both your expert knowledge and enthusiasm for your subject, and also your ability to share that knowledge with us in such a fascinating and enlightening way. Those of us who know Professor Plantinga will be very aware of her high personal standards, her attention to detail, and of a meticulous planning and preparation, all of which were clearly evident during this afternoon's lecture. I'm very, very aware of the long hours that Professor Plantinga has spent preparing for this afternoon's lecture, and all of this was, of course, undertaken at a time when she was also heavily involved in the university's preparations for the recent QAA audit. Miriam, we're incredibly grateful to you for your unstinting efforts and for delivering such an illuminating and memorable lecture this afternoon. I'm sure that Professor Plantinga will be happy to take a few questions from the audience, and those of you in the virtual room can ask your questions via the chat facility, and I'm sure Lodi will help me if any questions do appear on her screen. So, any questions for Miriam?
I'm also very happy if there are no questions. Randolph.
Yeah, well, congratulations, Miriam, on an excellent lecture. I wish I'd heard that lecture about 8 years ago when I went to Athens. And but what I'd like to know is, what do you think the impact of Hellenistic culture has been on the formation of the Christian Church over the last 2,000 years?
Oh. This is where the classicist will go. Ooh, I think it's an interesting question, but it's a big question, Randolph, and I think there's partly continuation of certain ideas, but there's also, if you can see, when they established a Christian church, that there was like, let's just destroy this, as it were, a reaction against it, and so I think, and I'm looking at Magdalena, I'm looking at Kyle, I'm it's like search a friend, search a classicist. I think it's a difficult question you've asked. It is one of the hardest questions you could have asked.
The term Hellenistic comes from Joyce.
Mm-hmm.
It's an 18th century classicist. But he derives it out of a word that's coined in the Maccabees.
Yeah.
The Hellenists. In the history of Maccabees, the Fawns, the Jews, were similar to society in contrast to Jews in that dispute. Which gives you a sense of how much the culture, not that far north and south, is influencing Jewish life, but then influences the development of post-Hellenism and the development of that early Christian church. So it comes out of that same engagement. But the extent that happens is in part what that means Jews.
I think, Randolph, you've asked a question that could take us hours to try to answer. Any other questions?
From the I'm going to get exactly the name wrong. From the sculptures that you were talking about.
Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest thing that we've done the next 200?
I think what I found, Steve, was when I tried to think what I wanted to do, I very quickly decided that I wanted to think about values, and that's something dear to my heart, but also I thought that was really important to think about. And then I really wanted to link the past and the present. And what I was surprised by when taking the catalogue and taking the Ultra and then looking at graduation and our history was how much of that narrative of identity, narrative of collaboration, of community. I think what the Altar of Zeus does so well is that you have to engage your community. You have to work in partnership. So that's what we do with with our students, that partnership work. You can't do something for someone, you have to do something with someone. I think that was what clearly came out of me working on that particular piece. Dylan.
Steve has asked it, but I just wonder if you were to look forward rather than looking back, and in 200 years' time, what kind of imagery or iconography do you think would be present to represent how that university is growing?
I think, and this is in a way interesting because we haven't been, you have the shield. We've got the continuing photos of graduation as a sort of a never-ending cycle, but it is also, it might make you think, are there things that we would want to do to sort of mark particular moments in time, to celebrate, to really step back and think, because so often we're moving from one deadline to the next deadline, but taking that time to celebrate, taking that time to mark time and to think about where we are in relation to past, present and future, and how those lines work. But I think the other thing you could see is how much you're not shackled by the past. You can do new things, but you will always do that honouring the past, as it were. Highly likely, Dylan. Yes, Tim.
Thank you, Professor. It seems that culture emerges between the challenge of the transience and the permanence.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What kinds of boundaries, artifacts, what can they teach us education, such as?
So this is where it starts to be really disputed. The altar, if we go back. So this sort of shows you this. The altar is just of such an unusual size, so much bigger, that they've been wondering where the sacrifice would have been made, and then often it's mentioned, obviously not after you've had everything going up the 20-meter stairs, and then would you have had that sacrifice there, or is it purely there honorary? Is it actually not functioning? At the same time, you've got the people walking past. That's very clear. The problem we have here is that there's only one ancient source where the altar is only mentioned very, very briefly in hardly any detail at all. So the problem is that we don't have literary evidence to tell us more about the function and what would have happened around that. So a lot of it is around speculation. So you have an intriguing mixture here between something which is really easy to understand, the gods always win, the giants always lose, but then when you start to go behind that surface meaning, that's when you come up at so many questions. There is an inscription, but again, that is heavily disputed still, but in a way that also makes this building fun. You don't want a building where everything is already decided, where you can't let your own imagination go, where you can't think, I'm going to be the one who's be able to sort of look at that and think about how that would have worked. So it's an intrigue. It's not an easy building to have included, but it is a building that makes you very clearly think about identity.
Do we have any questions?
You take back on these mythical tales, these are less and less known. What happens if these tales are not told anymore?
Well, this is why we need to keep doing classics. It is true. It is true. I think the this one shows how fragile narratives are and how easy they are to be lost, and how important it is that, in a way, if we look back to right at the beginning of the lecture, when the poet expressed the wish that this would be sung again and again and again, it shows that importance of that continuation, that keeping telling, that keeping that memory alive. But it's more than remembering a memory, it's also about celebrating. That's that crucial element as well. So it is, I think, up to us, if we think about the last bit, to keep our narrative alive, to be active participant in that narrative, and to work together on a narrative of who we are, who we aspire to be, and who we want to be. And I think they are important, because I hope I've shown people a glimpse of what classics can do and make you reflect on, and the relevance for us today. But there are so many other examples, Willem, with mythologies of other cultures, where unless we actively play our part to ensure the survival of knowledge and the survival of civilization, that's all of us doing that. Otherwise, it will go. Yeah. On that cheery note.
Thank you, Miriam. On reflecting on his inaugural lecture, a professor of history at another UK university described the experience as a bit of a trial, a definite rite of passage, but really nice to see old friends and colleagues. And all in all, actually a great experience, although I don't think I'd want to do another one. I don't know whether Professor Plantinga would agree with those sentiments, but I'm sure she would at this very, very moment, having successfully navigated the trial and rite of passage of the inaugural lecture, appreciate a well-earned cup of tea in the company of her parents, her friends and her colleagues. Felly wrth wahodd yr Athro Plantinga am baned, gai ddiolch i chi gyd am gefnogi'r digwyddiad hwn, ac i'r athro ymrannu ei hysgolheictod â ni, trwy gyfrwng I darlith fe'i strolgar ac amserol iawn y prynhawn yma. May I once again thank you all for your support this afternoon, those of you here in Yr Egin and those of you who have joined us online. And light refreshments, I'm pleased to say, will now be served here in Yr Egin. And we look forward indeed to welcoming you back to Yr Egin in a few months' time for the next inaugural lecture as part of our celebrations this year, our bicentenary celebrations here at the university. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi, a phrynhawn da.